Now we're going to talk about the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the brain, and then at the beginning of the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the different regions of the spinal cord because that directly correlates to the reflex arc. So surrounding the brain and spinal cord, we have several layers of protective connective tissue coverings. We have dura mater, and before we have dura mater, we have this epidural space. And the epidural space you're only going to find around the spinal cord, not in the skull, but the epidural epi means on top of, dural is talking about the dura mater. So this is a space that's on top of the dura mater, and if you've ever heard of an epidural injection during labor and delivery, this is where that injection would be administered. Its goal is not to completely paralyze from the waist or from the point of puncture down, but its goal is just to decrease pain sensations during labor. So starting at the first major connective tissue layer, we have dura mater. You don't need to know the two different types, you just need to know that dura mater has two layers, and that's the outermost meninge. Underneath the dura mater is the subdural space. So here we would have dura mater, and dura mater is actually connective tissue. But underneath the dura mater, we have this subdural space. Sub means underneath. If you've watched any episodes of Grey's Anatomy or any medical show, I'm sure you've heard of subdural hematomas before. So hematoma, that's just basically a blood clot, and this is where they tend to happen if we have any type of cranial injury. So subdural space. And then we have our next major meninge, the arachnoid mater. And underneath the arachnoid mater, we have this subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space contains cerebral spinal fluid. If you've ever had to have a spinal tap before, this is a picture of a spinal tap or a lumbar tap. So they're going to stick a very long needle in between the discs of the vertebrae, and then they're going to hear pop, which means they've gone through the dura mater, and another pop, which means that they've gone through the arachnoid mater, and then they start retrieving the spinal fluid from that area. This spinal fluid can be assayed or tested for blood, for infections, to see if they have any internal bleeding or any type of meningitis going on. Then we have our last matter, which is the pia mater. And the pia mater is the top layer of the central nervous system. So we have the top layer of the brain considered the pia mater, and the outermost layer of the spinal cord that is considered pia mater. Inside of the brain, we have cavities, and those cavities inside of the brain are called ventricles. So ventricles are cavities within the brain, and they contain cerebrospinal fluid. They're lined with ependymal cells, which make and circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. You don't need to know the names of all of the different ventricles or even their location. You just need to know what they are. So they're cavities within the brain, and they make and house that cerebrospinal fluid to nourish the brain. UW-Milwaukee is doing some research right now on fish and the size of their ventricles, and they're trying to alter the size of the ventricles and correlate that with mental disability in the fish. And you're probably like, how do you know if a fish is mentally retarded? Well, there's ways to tell that, and there's like different feeding times that the fish would no longer respond to and so forth. So there's ways that you can test that. But the unique thing about these fish is that you can see right through their skull. So you can actually measure the ventricles just by looking at them under certain specialized lights and microscopes, or stereoscopes. So they can see the size of the ventricles, and they've been correlating the size of the ventricles, shape, location, and so forth to mental deficits. And they think that it has to something to do with, human brain development and so forth. So that's kind of what they're looking at now. But here you can see the lateral ventricles on each side. And when we do our brain dissection, or if you get to use the online interface and do the brain dissection virtually, then you can see the ventricles in the inside of the brain. You'll be able to see those cavities. The third ventricle is in the middle, and then you have this cerebral aqueduct, which drains the cerebrospinal fluid into the spinal cord. And here you see this fourth ventricle. Sometimes, while the baby is leaving the birth canal, this cerebral aqueduct can get blocked. And sometimes it's just a birth defect that it gets blocked or whatever. If that gets blocked, it leads to hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus really means water on the brain. This looks much worse than it actually is. So with children, since their skull bones have not fused, the skull, or the brain, once it fills up with that fluid due to a kink in that cerebral aqueduct, the skull will actually bow out like this. But as soon as they put in a little shunt into that cerebral aqueduct and drain the water and the fluid off of the brain, that cerebrospinal fluid down into the spinal cord, usually the swelling goes down, the skull bones go back down, and everything looks normal. They usually don't have any lifelong disability. After all, they're just learning how to use their brain and making these initial neural connections. So usually this situation looks a lot worse than what it actually is. Now, if this happens as an adult, when your skull bones are fused together tightly, your skull bones can't exactly bow out. So in an adult, they would slip into a coma and potentially die due to the pressure of the brain in the skull. The different regions of the brain. So we have the cerebral hemispheres. Those are the big major parts of the brain. There's left and right hemisphere. The diencephalon is talking about the center of the brain. The brainstem goes from the center all the way down into the spinal cord. The cerebellum is this little tiny chunk of brain that's hanging underneath the cerebral hemispheres. And then the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is going to go down through the vertebral column. If we look at the surface of the brain has all sorts of bumps and grooves. And we have names for those bumps and grooves. Gyri are the bumps or the ridges that stick out on the surface of the brain. Sulci are the indentations on the brain. And a fissure is a deep sulcus. So a gyrus is singular while gyri are plural. Sulcus is singular while sulci is plural. And a fissure versus a fissures, those are singular versus plural. But here you can see all these ridges and so forth. The more ridges you have, the more surface area you have for the processing of information. So really intelligent animals are going to have lots of gyri and sulci, while kind of dumber animals are going to have less of these. So if you take a look at the surface of the sheep brain, it's relatively smooth compared to the surface of the human brain. Left and right hemispheres. So in people, the left side is associated with more of speech, analysis, time, sequence. It recognizes words, letters, numbers. It's more the factual side. While the right side is more responsible for creativity, patterns, spatial context. It recognizes faces, places, objects, and so forth. You don't need to know what side of the brain is responsible for what, and this is highly debated and continuously changing as we learn more and more about neuroscience. But these left and right hemispheres are divided by the longitudinal fissure. So now we go through some of the major lobes of the brain. The frontal lobe is responsible for higher level thinking, memory, information storage, and retrieval. In addition to knowing what it's responsible for, you need to know where it's located, so it's highlighted here in red. The parietal lobe is primarily responsible for the interpretation of sensory information, such as touch. The occipital lobe in the back of the brain is primarily responsible for the interpretation of vision. The temporal lobe on the sides of the brain, and it's on the other side as well, is responsible for the interpretation of sound and what we hear and balance. If you cut out the temporal lobe, deep to the temporal lobe is the insula. The insula has a lot of broad functions, but one function in particular, it contains the gustatory complex. So in other words, gustation or gustatory is referring to the sense of taste. So this allows for the interpretation of the sense of taste. The corpus callosum, sometimes pronounced corpus callosum, is right here, and that's going to connect the left and right hemispheres of the brain. The cerebellum is this smaller piece of brain tissue down here. Its functions are it creates fluid body movements, it predicts sequences of events during complex movements, it's involved with word association and puzzle solving, as well as posture. So the cerebellum is highly affected by alcohol. So if you think about what happens to you when you've been drinking alcohol, all of these things start to go, and this is why it's highly recommended that you do not drive while you're drinking, because especially for this reason, predict sequences of events during complex movements. When you're driving, you're able to predict certain things that are going to happen, and you lose that ability when you've been drinking. Former student of mine was sitting in class, and frequently she'd fall forward and then jerk her face back up, and I honestly thought that she was falling asleep in class, so I didn't think anything of it. And I was new to teaching, so I didn't want to call her out in front of the class, so I kind of just pretended that it wasn't happening and ignored it. Well, one day after class, after doing this pretty heavily, this falling forward and lifting her head back up type deal, she came up to me and said, I'm sorry that it looks like I'm falling asleep. Everyone always thinks that I'm falling asleep in class. I'm not. I have a depressed cerebellum. She said that she was born with her cerebellum sitting a little bit too low by 4 millimeters, and sometimes when it gets compressed, she loses the ability to maintain posture, and she'll just fall forward slightly and then have to correct herself. She said that there was a surgery that could help or decrease the disability due to it, but it wasn't worth the risk of the surgery. So she's like, I'll just deal with the fact that occasionally I feel like I'm falling forward. So that was kind of interesting that it, directly correlates to one of the functions of the cerebellum. There are two different parts of the cerebellum that I'd like you to know. So you see the gray matter, which is darker, on the outer edges, and then you see the white matter, which is white in color. The gray matter is actually the part of the brain and spinal cord, when we talk about the spinal cord, that's going to do stuff. That's where the neural connections are happening. That's going to be where information is processed. While the white part, or white matter, kind of like a buffer, a pass-through zone. Not a lot of processing happens there. The arbor vitae, or arbor vitae, is in the center of the cerebellum. And arbor vitae means tree of life, so that kind of looks like a branch-like tree of life. And the cerebellar cortex contains that gray matter on the outer edges of the cerebellum. The diencephalon consists of 3 parts: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, also known as the pineal gland. We've already talked about the hypothalamus and pineal gland in this class, but we're going to talk about each one of their functions individually now. So this is where the thalamus is located on each side of the cerebral hemispheres. The hypothalamus is in the center, and the pineal gland is in the back. And here's a side view and a front view. We're not going to worry about the pituitary gland so much. We will talk a little bit about it during our evaluation of the brain dissection, but we're not going to focus too much on it because that's really part of the endocrine system. The thalamus sorts, edits, and relays typically sensory information to the various parts of the brain. It mediates sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. So this I like to call the traffic controller. It's a big relay center in the brain. So when information comes into the brain, the thalamus has a lot of connections, and those connections are going to allow this information to travel to the various regions of the brain. The hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus does have an endocrine function. So it produces hormones for the posterior pituitary and controls the release of hormones for the anterior pituitary. But it also has the autonomic control center. So it regulates blood pressure, the rate and force of the heartbeat, the digestive tract motility. It regulates body temperature, food intake, water balance, and thirst. Body temperature is huge. This is where the thermostat of the body is. So when bacterial toxins or even certain components of viruses cause a fever in you, they're affecting the hypothalamus. The optic chiasma, we'll talk more about this once we get to the pathway of vision, but here you can see each eye, the optic nerve that leads from each eye, and the optic chiasma, or chiasm, is just this cross, this X-like structure on the underside of the brain. This is more of a structure that we're going to be visualizing during the brain dissection, not something that you're going to have to know a function for necessarily. The pineal gland here in the back of the brain is responsible for producing the hormone melatonin. And if you remember what melatonin does, it regulates the sleep-wake cycle. So now that we've got the brain cut in half here, remember this is the cerebral hemisphere. Here's the cerebellum. We have the cerebellar cortex and the arbor vitae in the center. We have thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland, and then here's the corpus callosum. Now we go on to the brainstem. The brainstem controls automatic behaviors that are necessary for survival. And there are three parts to the brainstem, the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And if we go back to this picture, this is the midbrain. This is the pons, and it sticks out like the letter P. And this is the medulla oblongata, which will eventually turn into the spinal cord once it leaves that foramen magnum of the skull. So together, the brainstem is responsible for autonomic reflexes. Cardiovascular center for heart contraction and blood vessel diameter, which can help regulate blood pressure. It's the respiratory center for respiratory rhythm. And these are the centers for vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, and even yawning. BROCA'S area. This is an association area that's involved with the mechanical movements involved in speech. Damage to the BROCA'S area means that you cannot move the muscles in order to form speech. Wernicke's area is back here in the brain, and this is an association area in the brain that's responsible for controlling the expression of words. You know what you want to say, and you know how to say it. You just can't put the words in the right order, whether you say them, type them, anything like that. So it controls the expression of words. If this is damaged, you're not able to properly convey messages. The limbic system is a series of numerous parts. You don't have to know all of the individual components of the limbic system, but together they work together to be responsible for memory storage, behavior, and emotions.